In 2019, a team of scientists at the University of Bristol published a paper in the journal Nature that changed how we think about prehistoric parenthood. They had been studying a handful of tiny clay vessels pulled from children's graves in Bavaria, Germany. These little pots were small enough to fit in a baby's hands. Some of them were shaped like animals, with stubby legs and long ears. Others had little spouts sticking out at odd angles, almost like a teapot designed by a toddler. Archaeologists had been finding objects like these at dig sites across Europe for decades, scattered through layers of earth dating back thousands of years. But nobody could say for certain what they were used for. Some researchers thought they were drinking vessels for sick adults. Others assumed they were simple grave goods, buried alongside the dead as ritual offerings. What nobody knew at the time was that locked inside the porous clay walls of these tiny pots was chemical evidence that would survive for over 3,000 years. Dr. Julie Dunn and her team ran lipid residue analysis on 3 of these vessels, 2 from a cemetery complex dating between 800 and 450 BC and 1 from a site dating between 1200 and 800 BC. The analysis detected fatty acid signatures from ruminant animal milk, cow milk, goat milk, sheep milk. These weren't grave offerings or vessels for the elderly. They were baby bottles, prehistoric baby bottles, and the milk residue trapped in their clay walls was the first direct chemical evidence of what ancient infants were actually eating. How does a species go from millions of years of breastfeeding as the only option to handing a baby a clay jug full of goat milk? That question takes us back much further than Bronze Age Germany. It takes us to the very beginning of how humans raised their young. For most of human history, babies ate exactly one thing: breast milk. That was it. There was no alternative, no backup plan, no formula on a shelf. If a mother could nurse, she did. If she couldn't, another woman in the group stepped in. Among hunter-gatherer communities, breastfeeding typically lasted somewhere between 2 and 4 years. Some populations nursed even longer. Isotopic studies of ancient bones from pre-agricultural societies suggest that exclusive breastfeeding often continued for the first 2 years of a child's life, with gradual weaning stretching out until age 3 or 4. And this long breastfeeding period was not just a cultural preference, it was a biological necessity. Hunter-gatherer mothers had no domesticated animals, no grain, no soft-cooked cereals. There was simply nothing else safe to feed a baby. This created a brutal problem if anything went wrong. If a mother died during or after childbirth, the baby needed another lactating woman immediately, or it would starve. If the mother became too sick to nurse, the baby was in danger. If she was injured during a hunt or a migration and her milk dried up, there was no backup. Cross-nursing, where other women in the group would share breastfeeding duties, was almost certainly practiced. It would have been the only option, and it may explain why human social groups evolved to be cooperative in ways that other primates are not. Keeping babies alive was a community effort, not just a maternal one. That extended nursing had a massive side effect that shaped the entire trajectory of human populations. Breastfeeding suppresses ovulation. The hormonal changes triggered by regular, frequent nursing delay a mother's return to fertility. Among hunter-gatherer populations, this natural spacing pushed births apart by 5 to 7 years. A woman might have 4 or 5 children in her entire lifetime. Populations grew slowly, if at all. For tens of thousands of years, this was just how it worked. Babies nursed. Mothers waited. The next child came when biology allowed it. And then, roughly 12,000 years ago, everything changed. Not because of some medical breakthrough or cultural awakening, because of wheat and barley and goats. The Neolithic revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, is usually talked about in terms of cities and civilizations and the birth of complex societies. But there is another way to think about it, one that rarely gets mentioned. The Neolithic revolution was also a baby food revolution. For the first time in human history, mothers had options. Domesticated cows, sheep, and goats meant a supply of animal milk that did not require another woman to produce. Cereal grains, like wheat and barley, could be ground and boiled into soft porridge that even a toothless infant could swallow. The world had not invented formula, but it had invented the raw materials for something close. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Supplementing breast milk with animal milk and grain porridge meant babies could be weaned earlier. Earlier weaning meant mothers resumed ovulation sooner, and that meant more babies, faster. Agricultural women could potentially have children every 1 to 2 years instead of every 5 to 7. Think about what that means in practice. A hunter-gatherer woman who lived to age 40 might raise 3 or 4 children to adulthood. A farming woman of the same age could potentially have 8 or 10. Within a few generations, the math becomes staggering. More children meant more hands for farm work, which meant more food, which meant more children. Anthropologists call this the lock-in effect, a feedback loop that made the agricultural way of life nearly impossible to abandon once it started. Now, pay attention to this next detail, because it explains a lot about what came after. Feeding babies animal milk in the ancient world was not exactly safe. Adults in these early farming communities were largely lactose intolerant. Genetic studies suggest that the ability to digest milk past infancy did not become widespread in European populations until thousands of years after the first farmers kept dairy animals. So these communities were giving their babies milk from animals that even the adults could barely digest. Some researchers believe they may have partially solved this by fermenting milk into something like yogurt or soft cheese, which would have reduced the lactose content. Others think the babies simply suffered through digestive problems that modern parents would find alarming, and contamination was another constant threat. Raw animal milk in a world without refrigeration, pasteurization, or basic germ theory was a vector for every kind of bacterial infection imaginable. Pottery vessels were nearly impossible to clean thoroughly. Residue built up in the porous clay walls. Milk soured quickly in warm climates. A baby drinking from a clay vessel that had not been properly cleaned might be exposed to bacteria that could cause dysentery, which in the ancient world was frequently fatal for infants. The fact that parents kept using these vessels anyway tells us something important about how desperate the need was. When the alternative was starvation because the mother could not produce enough milk, contaminated goat milk in a dirty pot was still a better option than nothing at all. The archaeological evidence for this early period of experimental baby feeding is sparse but extraordinary. At the Neolithic site of Grad Starcevo, on the left bank of the Danube River in Serbia, archaeologists in the 1930s uncovered 50 small spatula-shaped objects carved from cattle bone. For decades, these were catalogued as tools, scraping implements, maybe, craft accessories. Nobody gave them a second thought. But in 2019, researcher Sofija Stefanovic and her team took a closer look. The spoons were tiny, too small for adult hands to use comfortably, and they were covered in marks, thousands of marks. Stefanovic's team compared over 2,000 marks on 3 of these spoons, with more than 3,000 marks produced experimentally by primary teeth. Baby teeth. The match was unmistakable. Infants had been chewing on these spoons, gnawing on them, teething on them. These were not tools. They were feeding implements for babies, carved from cow bone roughly 8,000 years ago, and used to scoop soft grain porridge into tiny mouths. Some of the spoons showed so many teeth marks that they were visibly worn down, as though the same baby had used the same spoon over months of teething and feeding. In a world without Sophie the giraffe or silicone teething rings, a smooth bone spoon was apparently the next best thing. The abundance of these spoons at Neolithic sites tells us something profound. New baby foods had become important enough for communities to develop dedicated equipment. Prehistoric parents were not just throwing scraps at their kids. They were crafting specialized utensils to feed them. And while the spoons and clay bottles give us physical evidence, there was another ancient feeding method that left no artifacts behind at all, because it required no tools, just a mother's mouth. Pre-mastication. the scientific term for chewing food and then transferring it directly to your baby, mouth to mouth. If that sounds strange, consider that it was the standard method of introducing solid food to infants for most of human history. Ethnographers have documented it on every continent and in every type of society, from hunter-gatherers in the Amazon to farming communities in sub-Saharan Africa. In parts of Nigeria, roughly 80% of babies still receive pre-chewed food today. Among the Tsimane, forager horticulturalists living in the Bolivian Amazon, it remains a routine part of infant feeding. The logic behind it is straightforward once you stop and think about it. Babies need non-milk food in their diets starting at around 6 months old, but they do not develop the molars they need to chew most solid food until they are 18 to 24 months old. For our ancestors, who had no blenders, no food processors, and no jars of pureed sweet potato from a store, pre-mastication was the obvious solution. Chew the food, make it soft. Give it to the baby. According to Gretel Pelto, an anthropologist at Cornell University, this was the primary method of complementary feeding for most of human history, and it turns out pre-mastication was doing something more than just softening food. By transferring traces of disease pathogens from her own saliva, a mother was essentially giving her baby a starter kit for its immune system. Recent research suggests the practice parallels the immune-building benefits of breastfeeding itself. The mother's saliva contains antibodies that help prime the infant's immune response, which, looking back, makes the eventual abandonment of pre-mastication in many Western cultures seem less like progress and more like a trade-off nobody fully understood at the time. Now, the story of ancient baby food gets truly bizarre when we move forward in time to the great civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean. Because before we even get to Greece and Rome, we need to talk about Egypt. In ancient Egypt, breastfeeding was not just a practical matter, it was sacred. The goddess Isis was depicted in hieroglyphics and paintings, nursing her son Horus. And this imagery reinforced a cultural expectation that mothers should breastfeed as their divine duty. Egyptian mothers typically nursed their infants until around 6 months of age, after which cow milk was gradually introduced. But the Egyptians also recognized that breastfeeding did not always work out. Mothers died in childbirth, milk supplies failed, babies were orphaned. And so Egypt became one of the earliest civilizations to formalize the profession of wet nursing, creating contracts and legal structures around the practice that would influence cultures across the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. Because the Greeks and Romans had opinions about infant feeding, strong, detailed, occasionally alarming opinions. Cyrannus of Ephesus, a Greek physician practicing in Rome during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, wrote one of the most detailed surviving guides to infant care in the ancient world. His recommendations reveal a world where baby feeding was taken extremely seriously, but approached with ideas that would horrify a modern pediatrician. Cyrannus was in favor of breastfeeding. He advocated for it as the best method of infant nutrition. But he had a catch. He believed colostrum, the thick yellowish milk a mother produces in the first days after birth, was harmful to newborns. He recommended that mothers should not breastfeed for the first few days. Instead, the infant should be given small amounts of honey. He was not alone in this belief. Across the Byzantine Empire, it was common practice to feed newborns honey during their first 4 days of life, while waiting for the mother's milk to thin out and become what they considered suitable. Oribasius, a Greek physician serving Emperor Julian in the 4th century, shared a similar prejudice against colostrum. Aristotle, writing centuries earlier, also considered early breast milk to be unsuitable, though he at least believed that mothers themselves should do the nursing once the milk was deemed acceptable. We now know that colostrum is one of the most nutritionally dense and immunologically critical substances a newborn can receive. It is packed with antibodies, white blood cells, and growth factors that help establish a baby's immune system in its earliest hours. The ancient physicians had it exactly backwards. And no, that is not a typo, by the way. They genuinely threw out the best part. Cyrannus went further with his feeding recommendations. He advised introducing semi-solid foods at around 6 months, timed to the onset of teething. His recipe list included breadcrumbs soaked in milk, mead, sweet wine, or wine sweetened with honey. Later, he suggested moving on to very runny porridge and soft-boiled eggs. These recommendations were echoed and built upon by later physicians like Galen of Pergamon, who spent most of his professional life in Rome and wrote primarily for the Roman aristocracy. If you are wondering how that is even legal, so is everyone else. But remember, ancient physicians did not have the tools or knowledge to understand why colostrum was valuable. They judged milk by its appearance and consistency, not by its immunological properties. To their eyes, colostrum looked thick, discolored, and different from regular milk. Different meant suspicious, and suspicious meant potentially harmful. That logic was wrong, but it was consistent with their methods. Meanwhile, in other parts of the ancient Greek world, things were even more creative. Some communities fed their infants a mixture of wine and honey using small, specialized vessels. Clay-feeding jugs have been discovered at archaeological sites in Cyprus, dating back to around 2000 BC, suggesting that breast milk substitutes have been attempted for at least 4,000 years. The idea of giving wine to a baby strikes modern parents as insane, but the ancients likely diluted it significantly and may have valued it as much for its caloric content as for any perceived medicinal benefit. Water in the ancient world was often contaminated, and diluted wine was considered a safer alternative for adults. The extension of this logic to infants, while wrong by modern standards, had its own internal consistency. If you are learning something new from this video, hit subscribe. We cover forgotten history like this every week. For mothers who could not, or chose not to breastfeed, the ancient world had another solution that became an entire industry: wet nursing. The practice of hiring another woman to breastfeed your child is one of the oldest documented professions in human history. Written contracts for wet nurses have been found dating to the 18th century BC in Babylon. In ancient Egypt, wet nursing was widespread, and breastfeeding was depicted in hieroglyphics as a sacred act. The goddess Isis was frequently shown nursing her son Horus, reinforcing the cultural reverence attached to the practice. In Rome, wet nursing became a fixture of wealthy family life. Contracts were remarkably detailed. A surviving Egyptian wet nursing contract from 13 BC specifies that the nurse, a woman named Didyma, was hired to feed a baby who had been abandoned and taken in as a slave. The contract outlines her pay and explicitly forbids her from sleeping with a man, becoming pregnant, or nursing another child during the contract period. Soranus himself wrote a detailed profile of the ideal wet nurse. She should be between 20 and 40 years old, honest, even-tempered, pleasant, in good health, with a good complexion, of average size, and her own child should be less than 2 months old. Her milk should be neither too thick nor too thin. He even described a quality test. If you placed a drop of breast milk on a fingernail and tilted the finger, ideal milk should be thick enough not to slide off. The selection process for a wet nurse reveals how seriously the ancients took infant nutrition, even when their understanding of the science was wildly off. There was a widespread belief that the character and temperament of the wet nurse could be transmitted to the child through her milk. A dishonest nurse might produce a dishonest child. An ill-tempered nurse might create an ill-tempered baby. This idea persisted across multiple civilizations for centuries. It was completely wrong, of course, but it meant that wet nurse selection was treated with a gravity that bordered on obsession. Families would interview candidates, inspect their physical health, evaluate their personalities, and test their milk quality before entrusting a child to their care. Not everyone was on board with the practice, though. Aristotle and Plutarch were vocal critics who believed breastfeeding was a duty that mothers owed their children. Cicero and Tacitus attacked wealthy Roman women who used wet nurses as decadent and negligent. They argued that outsourcing this fundamental act of motherhood endangered the stability of Roman society itself. There is a reason this story is still talked about today. These debates over who should feed babies, and how, and why, sound strikingly familiar to anyone who has followed modern arguments about breastfeeding, formula, and working motherhood. By the 1st century AD, if you were a baby born into the Roman world, your early diet might have included some combination of breast milk from your mother or a hired wet nurse, diluted animal milk, honey, wine, soft bread, porridge, and eggs. Avicenna, a Persian physician and philosopher writing slightly later, recommended breastfeeding for a full 2 years, followed by a gradual transition to solid foods. Across the ancient world, the specific recommendations varied, but the general pattern held: breast milk first, animal milk, and soft foods next. Full adult food by age 2 or 3. If you were less fortunate and born into poverty, your options were narrower, but not necessarily worse. Poor women breastfed their own children because they could not afford alternatives. In a cruel irony, their babies may have been better nourished for it. The real breakthrough in understanding what ancient babies ate has come not from written records, but from the bones themselves. Over the past 2 decades, isotopic analysis has given archaeologists an astonishing tool for reconstructing infant diets across millennia. The technique works because breastfed infants occupy a higher position in the food chain than their mothers. When a baby drinks breast milk, it is essentially consuming its mother's body tissue, which elevates the nitrogen isotope ratios in the baby's own bones. As the child is weaned onto other foods, those ratios drop back down to levels consistent with the general population. By measuring nitrogen and carbon isotope ratios in the bones and teeth of ancient infants and comparing them to adult females from the same population, researchers can estimate when breastfeeding started to decrease, when supplementary foods were introduced, and approximately when weaning was complete. What makes this technique so remarkable is that it works across vast stretches of time. A baby who was breastfed in Neolithic Turkey leaves the same kind of isotopic signature as a baby who was breastfed in Roman Britain or pre-Columbian Cuba. The chemistry does not care about culture or geography. It just records what the child ate. The results have been remarkably consistent across dozens of studies spanning thousands of years and multiple continents. In most pre-industrial populations, exclusive breastfeeding appears to have lasted for at least the first 6 months. Supplementary foods were introduced gradually after that point. Complete weaning typically occurred somewhere between 2 and 3 years of age. Weaning before 18 months was extremely rare before the post-medieval period. One large-scale analysis found no significant difference in weaning age between hunter-gatherer and agricultural populations, with the average age at the end of weaning estimated at roughly 2.8 years across all groups studied. The idea that farming made weaning dramatically earlier turns out to be more complicated than researchers initially assumed. But isotopic evidence also reveals something else: variation, lots of it. Within the same archaeological site, some infants show isotopic signatures suggesting breastfeeding continued until age 4 or 5, while others appear to have been weaned by their first birthday. This variation likely reflects the same factors that drive differences in infant feeding today: individual health, maternal circumstances, the availability of food, whether the mother survived, whether the child was healthy enough to nurse. The numbers tell a population-level story, but behind every data point was a specific baby, a specific mother, and a specific set of circumstances that determined what that child ate. And that might be the most important thing this entire story reveals. Ancient parents were not following some rigid prehistoric program. They were adapting, improvising, trying to keep their children alive with whatever resources they had. A Neolithic mother in Serbia, carving a tiny spoon from cattle bone to feed her baby soft gruel, was solving the same problem that a Roman mother was solving when she hired a wet nurse. The same problem a Bronze Age mother in Bavaria was solving when she shaped a little clay animal with a spout and filled it with goat milk. How do I feed this child? How do I keep this baby alive? The clay baby bottles from Bavaria are particularly striking because of where they were found. In children's graves, these little vessels, sometimes shaped like hedgehogs or imaginary animals with stubby legs, were placed alongside infants who had died. Dr. Dunn herself described holding the bottles and feeling a connection across thousands of years. A parent who had lost a child placed their feeding vessel in the grave with them. The same parent who had watched their baby grip the little clay animal and suckle milk through its spout. That act of burial tells us something that no isotopic analysis or chemical residue test ever could. It tells us about love. The archaeological record is full of gaps and silence when it comes to children. For most of the history of the discipline, babies and mothers were afterthoughts. Dig sites focused on tools, weapons, architecture, and adult remains. The study of prehistoric motherhood, of how babies were fed and cared for, is still a relatively young field. Projects like the European Research Council's Birth Initiative are only now beginning to systematically investigate the biological and cultural aspects of having children in the ancient world. What we have learned so far suggests that the picture we inherited, the idea of brutal, careless, prehistoric parents losing half their children to neglect, is not supported by the evidence. Research from the Australian National University has challenged the long-held assumption that roughly 40% of prehistoric babies died in their first year. Claire McFadden and her colleagues found that the number of infant burials at ancient sites reflects how many babies were being born, not how many were dying. If mothers were having lots of babies, it stands to reason they were also capable of caring for them. Something about these findings cuts through the usual distance we feel when looking at the ancient world. We can look at a Roman aqueduct and admire the engineering. We can study a Greek temple and appreciate the architecture. But a tiny clay bottle shaped like a hedgehog, placed in a child's grave by a grieving parent, hits different. It makes the ancient world feel close. It makes those people feel real in a way that grand monuments never quite manage. The methods change. The instincts do not. 8,000 years ago, a mother on the banks of the Danube ground grain into paste, spooned it carefully into her baby's mouth, and watched to see if the child would swallow. 3,000 years ago, a mother in Bavaria filled a tiny clay jug with warm goat milk and handed it to her infant. 2,000 years ago, a physician in Rome pressed a drop of breast milk onto his thumbnail and tilted his hand, checking whether the consistency was good enough for a newborn. Every one of these moments is a small, quiet act of devotion. And every one of them survived, in bone and clay and chemical residue, long enough for us to find them. And consider this. Many of the innovations that ancient parents stumbled onto through trial and error are now being re-examined by modern science. Pre-mastication, dismissed for decades as unhygienic, turns out to offer genuine immunological benefits that researchers are only now beginning to quantify. Extended breastfeeding, treated as unnecessary by mid-20th century Western medicine, is now recommended by the World Health Organization for at least 2 years. The ancients did not always get it right. The honey and wine were bad ideas. The rejection of colostrum was a mistake with real consequences. But the underlying instinct, the drive to find safe, nourishing food for vulnerable infants using whatever resources were available, was as sound then as it is now. What we feed babies has always been one of the most important decisions a parent makes. The tools have changed. The science has improved. But the question at the center of all of it is exactly the same question it was 8,000 years ago. What does this baby need, and how do I give it to them? If this video taught you something you did not know before, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which ancient baby feeding fact surprised you the most. We cover stories like this every week, and your support helps us keep making them.